just water. I understand the confusion, the colorblind confusion. I do. Being colorblind seems like the pinnacle of equality. Surely it's a good thing. Being colorblind is about treating all people the same, without regard for race and ethnicity. It's saying, I will treat you the same. I will not treat you differently simply because you have a different skin color than me. Our congregation's bylaws has a now standard non-discrimination clause of the full participation of persons without regard to actual or perceived race, class, color, culture, or national origin, and so on. Our Unitarian Universalist principles and values call for equity, for treating all people with inherent worth and dignity. It's also one of the tenets of the American legal system that all are equal under the law. It was a central point of the 1960s civil rights movement that everyone be treated equally. Dr. King, in his landmark speech, said, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. It almost seems like all of this focus on the color of our skin is the problem. Wouldn't it be better if we could all just be colorblind? King asked us to focus on the content of each other's character instead of the color of each other's skin. Even the great Dr. King wants us to be colorblind. Except, to reach that conclusion, one must ignore the context of that famous quote. One must misunderstand the whole point of the speech, of the rally, of that moment in history that is the context of that quote from Dr. King. The problem is that being colorblind is a form of ignoring important aspects of a person's identity and experience. Being colorblind claims there are no race-based differences, and in so claiming, ignores and refuses to deal with the reality of those differences. Being colorblind is to pretend systemic racism does not exist, which is essentially to be complacent and even complicit with that racism. What Dr. King was calling for was a change in the system. The context of that amazing quote from Dr. King is that he wanted the nation to pay attention to the problem of racism. He wanted our nation to live out the noble principles in its founding documents rather than keep acting terribly toward black people and other minorities. Fast forward a few decades, and people have twisted Dr. King's words into an excuse to pretend that everything is equal now. Pauli Murray was a civil rights activist, author, lawyer, poet, and priest. Her name is credited in our order of service for some of the worship elements. She earned degrees from Harvard, Yale, and Berkeley. She came of age during World War I, raised by her maternal grandparents in North Carolina. Thurgood Marshall, when he was still chief counsel for the NAACP, called Murray's 1950 book, States' Laws on Race and Color, the Bible of the Civil Rights Movement. Murray was co-founder of NOW, the National Organization of Women. She was a strong influence on Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and many now retroactively credit her with being non-binary and transgender long before such terms were in common use. Pauli Murray was hugely influential in a multitude of human rights issues over the course of several decades, yet almost no one knows about her today. There's a documentary about her life worth watching, but why has she been so forgotten? Do you remember the landmark Supreme Court case Brown versus Board of Education? It was meant to desegregate our schools, to give children access to opportunities without regard to race or color. Did it work? Decades after Brown versus Board of Education, our public schools are still effectively segregated because our neighborhoods are still effectively segregated. We can successfully predict more about a child's upward mobility from their zip code than by their SAT scores or if their parents read to them each day. It doesn't take much to uncover the reality of inequality in our country. Why would we pretend there is no racial component connected to that inequality? It is necessary to look at what is going on with a critical lens, to challenge ideas that try to ignore the real problem. Here's yet another example. We all know that our country has abolished slavery, right? The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, right? Wrong. I was taught that it did. But when we read the language of the amendment, we find this: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So, slavery is still permitted in our country under certain conditions. That's not the same as saying slavery is abolished. Our mass incarceration system is a continuation of slavery. It says exactly that in our Constitution. And if we pretend that we are colorblind, we'll completely miss the racist implications of who is filling our prison cells. It's necessary to look at what is going on with a critical lens, to challenge the idea that we are being asked to ignore. These examples, the life of Pauli Murray, the Brown versus Board of Education amendment, the 13th Amendment, the Brown versus Board of Education case, and the 13th Amendment, they lead me into this topic of critical race theory. Critical race theory, or CRT, became a hot-button issue over the previous year. Largely as a form of distraction to stir up the conservative base, a study shows that Fox News had mentioned critical race theory almost 2,000 times in a 3-month period in the spring of 2021. That breaks down to about 20 times a day for 90 consecutive days. But with all that hype, most people still did not really know what CRT was. Simply put, critical race theory is a legal theory related to constitutional law and other related law issues. More specifically, it states that our social institutions have racism baked into them as how they function. It focuses on the legal aspects of institutional racism. Our criminal justice system, our educational system, labor market and housing market and healthcare system, they're all laced with racism embedded in laws, regulations, rules, and procedures that lead to a differential outcome in race. That's what critical race theory says. That our systems are laced with racism embedded in laws, regulations, rules, and procedures that lead to differential outcomes by race. Critical race theory is a legal concept. It started with legal scholars Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw and others in the 1970s talking about the need to look critically at our legal system in terms of race. Are the purportedly race-neutral documents and laws actually race-neutral? Were they ever meant to be? Is their impact such? Do our U.S. laws alleviate or perpetuate racism? Rather than accept the legal stance of race neutrality at face value, CRT asks us to think critically about it. Let's pause for a minute and notice that the big cultural argument about CRT is whether or not it should be taught to our children in our public schools. The sensational claim was that our children were being indoctrinated with CRT, that white kids were being taught to hate themselves, which is just so wildly inaccurate that it must be obvious fear-mongering. And yet people bought into that fear. Again, CRT is about legal theory related to constitutional law. CRT per se is not taught in our K through 12 public school system. Not really. Critical thinking is taught in our public school systems, and the word critical is key because it's used the same way in CRT as when we're talking about critical thinking. Our Unitarian Universalist values do indeed call us to treat all people with inherent worth and dignity, to promote equity in our human relations, and our faith calls us to promote justice and liberty and truth. Never forget that one. Truth. A key value for us is the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. When we look at religious texts, for example, we weigh these texts against our experiences and against the reality as we know it. We read, for example, in the Quran, "The heavens, we have built them with power, and verily we are expanding it." That can sound pretty cool and rather modern, an expanding heavens. But we also recognize that when the Quran was written, the scientific concept of an expanding universe was not a viable theory yet. But it does provide an opening between modern scientific understanding of the universe and Islamic faith today. When we read, for example, in the Christian scripture about how Jesus calls Peter the rock on which I build my church, yet we know that there was no Christian church at that point, we can recognize that this is a later addition added by an editor, something that evidently happened quite a bit with Christian scripture as it was taking shape. We don't take such texts at face value. We interpret them through their context. We weigh them based on who the original hearers were. What was the historical situation? Did the author have a particular agenda they were trying to convey? And Unitarian Universalism promotes these same values in the public sphere, not just in our religious explorations. Critical thinking is a value that we strive to bring when we are taking in the news and current affairs, not just ancient religious texts. When presented with the issue of being colorblind, for example, we can acknowledge that the goal, it is noble to be equitable. But we are not let off the hook by that ideal. We are drawn to ask who benefits from presenting an issue this way or that way. Does a particular law or practice actually accomplish what it was created to accomplish? Who is included in this version of our community, and who is left behind when we pretend to not consider a person's skin color? As people of faith, this is important to us. It's important for us to engage in a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. It is one of our core values. The critical part of critical race theory is a key piece of how we engage all of our religious and secular explorations as people of faith. Shifting gears a bit and digging in a little more, the conservative argument against CRT is against an applied version of critical race theory in our schools. The applied version takes the basic tenets of the theory and applies them to things like history and education. Central to this, as I've already stated, is the idea of institutionalized racism and white supremacy. The conservative argument goes on to say that the implications of this applied version of CRT that is honestly being taught, offered in our public school systems, they say that the implication is that all white people, all white children of course, are taught that they are oppressors, while all black people, and by implication all black children, are taught that they are victims. Now, I have said before on other Sundays, and it bears repeating, if your anti-racism work centers around making white people feel bad, then you're doing it wrong. I may feel bad. That may still happen, but that's not the goal. I may feel bad as a white person, as an American, to learn about the Tulsa race massacre, or about the prevalence of lynching, or about the killing of black and brown people by police indiscriminately, but that's not the point of the work, to feel bad. The point of the work is for us to grapple with the atrocities so that we may be bold in making changes for a better society. The people banning critical race theory make it sound like the goal is to make all white people feel bad about themselves, and that's simply not true. And certainly is a cipher, from what I can tell. It's coded way just to stir up the conservative base. The real goal of CRT is to fix the structures in our society that continue to disadvantage and harm people of color. As Unitarian Universalists, we are committed to building a more just and beautiful world together. We are committed to not being colorblind so much as color celebrating, to celebrate our differences, learning from each other, leaning into the unique ways we each experience this life. As Unitarian Universalists, we are committed to grappling with injustices, sifting through the discomforts that may arise for the sake of the better world that we can still create together. In a world without end, may it be so.